G'day guys, Mackie with the Outer Circle, and today I want to talk about how a model goes from first concepts or conceptualization right down to the point where it actually arrives on the tabletop and you're able to use it. Now, yesterday when I was talking about that new piece of shit Nurgle tank, I did say, some pretentious designer was probably involved, blah 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 blah. It's actually a lot more complicated process than that. The pretentiousness of the sculptor is neither here nor there, really, in the process. And today what I'm going to do is actually go through step by step, as directly said to me by someone who actually works in the industry as a sculptor for a major miniatures company. I will not say which, and I will not say who, but I am aiming at some point to have them on the show. So, see how we go. And if that happens, we'll get them to go through in depth their experiences. But until then, this will have to bide you over. Now, the first step when designing a new model is that the managing directors, middle management and writers will sit down in a meeting to discuss the next book release, its contents, plot and outline. Sales reports are reviewed, and the market's current state and direction is all taken into consideration at this point. Once it's been determined where they want to go, the managing director will step off, and that leaves the many naughty words here, middle management staff to sit for yet more meetings with the writers, apparently eating a crap ton of cake and talking specifics on model requirements to support the plotline. The third step in the process, artists will be invited in to help establish the appearance, makeup and general aesthetic of the models to be built. This is done with the writers over the span of yet more meetings. If there is cake, then the middle management will indeed be present for these as well. The fourth step. Once the new aesthetic, model count and composition is determined by the writers/middle management, then these lists are sent to the sculptors, who are then forced to churn out the highly uninspired shite with next to no input whatsoever. These sculptors are then micromanaged by middle management, the writers, and also every possible other non-creative in the business within walking distance. Which ties into point 5. The models are then sculpted, rehashed, and redone, and churned over and over and over until the writers, middle management, and the general consensus of the design studio is that they are okay and good to go. I'll point out that this is why you see Magnus the Red in different scales for 40k, how there was pre-concept design where he was about the size of a regular Demon Prince or a Dreadnought, as well as the later design where he's obviously the size of an Imperial Knight. That's all a part of this step in the process. Point number 6. The models will then go back up the chain of command for signing off, budgeting and commercial strategic planning, i.e. determining the release schedule, price points, etc. etc. Once approved, the models, and this is now point 7, are sent off to the moulding and casting department, where they will mostly tend to screw things up for themselves, with every step of the process also being highly micromanaged. Once the first casts return, they go straight to the paint and photography department. This business model comes directly from Games Workshop and is applied to pretty much every miniatures gaming company out there, run or devised by ex-Games Workshop staff. Hence, their policies continue throughout the industry, albeit indirectly. Now, interesting point to note there was how when they reach the mould, this is where things get difficult. This is quite true. Having made moulds myself, mainly for industry, not for miniatures, apart from the occasional silicon mould, there's many different ways you can mould something or cast something. Often they'll do a thing called the lost wax process for very basic, simple stuff. It was often used for things like chandeliers and candles and stuff like that, where it's not too intricate. But when you're talking about sort of models, you can't really use that process. It's not detailed enough or fine enough. So instead, what will often happen is models will be digitally scanned these days, or the models themselves come from a rapid fabrication process such as 3D printing, and in fact you will see 3D printing marks on several models. What will also happen is that models will be painted in CAD, essentially. Painted in ZBrush or a 3D rendering program. These can then be translated into a CNC machine, such as a CNC milling machine. The CNC milling machine will then get given the die of choice, usually a mag alloy, a steel, or a titanium compound. Why are these metals? Well, steel and aluminium are cheap. Aluminium get the worst results. Steel, on the other hand, whilst giving good results, can be a real bitch to clean. Titanium, fantastic, best results, incredibly expensive process. It has come down quite a bit over the years, but I mean, think about it. How often do you see refined titanium products laying around? Not very often. It's an expensive material. Working in industry, whenever we machine titanium, we collect up all the scrap afterwards and recycle it because it is that expensive. A good piece of titanium at a high quality can be up to $500 Australian for a piece the size of your fist. So, fantastically expensive material. Now, these will be machined out by a CNC mill, generally. Hopefully I can get some footage of that into the video, but, you know, copyright strikes and all that kind of thing on YouTube probably won't happen. And what will happen is, once the die, which is a negative of the model, of course, is machined out, someone has to come in by hand and clean it up. This is often done by someone who's a jeweler, or has experience working at that micro detailing level with metal surfaces, and they'll often use like tiny scrapers, files, little die grinders, things like that, and they're doing very incremental changes to the die, and that is why it's such a hard process. What would happen 10 to 15 years ago was, I know from experience, Games Workshop would sculpt a larger maquette or mock-up. So they would sculpt I do remember a picture in White Dwarf of it, in fact, say a Lizard Mansaurus, and it would be about 8 to 10 inches tall. And then what would happen is, once they've got that, they work out their ideas on that scale, and then they would translate that to the 28mm scale. From there, it would then get sent off to mould. Obviously, there's only so much you can do with that process, and that's why models were much simpler a long time ago, because it was very hard to translate those to a good mold that will last long term. This is back in the days where digitally scanning a physical model and then machining molds from it was much more time-consuming process, or even just couldn't be done. Many models even now are still done with white metals because they're much, much easier to do. By the way, this very first one that's created, the master, is often kept by the company, and it's not like what will come after it. It's incredibly highly detailed, and every copy of it that comes after will have worse detail, and this is used again and again and again, this master, to create the best molds possible. You won't always get that. What will often happen is what we call second and third generation molds, which is molds that are taken off casts that were taken from the first cast. So, I know it's probably confusing, but think of it this way. It's like a photocopy of a photocopy. So yeah, the molding part is incredibly time-consuming part of the process, and that's where the money's tied up, of course, with these models. That said, when you produce a lot of them, like Space Marine Tactical Squads, that price really works out over time. Like, you'll get about, depending how many models you're producing, but a lot of plastic companies will get nearly a week out of a mold before they have to pull the mold out for reconditioning. That's because small amounts of plastic stick to the inside of the mold, release agents start to gunk up in there, you lose detail, the mold doesn't sit completely flush anymore, and you get larger mold flash. At that point, what happens is someone has to go in and physically clean out every single mold, usually just by hand with acetone and a cloth and a toothbrush, and yeah. If anyone's actually curious on that process, I would suggest looking up the Lego Mega Factories program, and they'll fill you in more on how it's done. Now, getting back to the sculpting process, as was pointed out, when models are first sculpted, that's a long way down the line. writers and people who aren't necessarily artistically minded. I mean, you are talking middle and upper management here. People who don't even participate in the hobby have decided for you what your model should be. And the sculptor's job at this point is simply to translate their ideas, no matter how good or bad, into something physical. And this is where I myself am at fault, and I do owe an apology to sculptors, because I do often shit on the sculptors themselves for what comes out. But it's not really their fault. They're just doing what they're told. They're zipperheads. No offense to them, but zipperhead, by the way, is not like a derogatory term towards any race or gender. It just means you unzip the head, brain comes out, you zip the head back up. Because that's what they're treated like. They're treated like a drone, someone who's just there to perform the operations of a computer, essentially a machine. Which is kind of sad that sculptors don't have that artistic freedom. And it is something that's caused many sculptors to actually leave Games Workshop over the years. Which is neither here nor there. Anyway, I hope this has been informative. As I said, I will endeavour to actually get a professional sculptor onto the show. And they can run us through the process from their actual perspective in the big scheme of things at some point. Anyway, I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Hope this episode has actually been interesting and worth something to you, and I'll see you all next time.